Hello, everyone. We will dedicate this session of this morning to the redistribution of sector maps. And speaking about maps, with the crisis that is here and probably here to stay, the French population watches maps falling down, some plans, some redundancy scheme in the automotive sector. And they're also hoping at the same time that new cards are going to emerge in new sectors. And they're hoping a lot on technology, green jobs, and relocalization. So we're going to figure out if these hopes will be met and how will these maps be redistributed. And in order to understand the value chains and their complexity, we are welcoming several experts coming from different backgrounds. First of all, LEHMANN, who's a former state secretary for industry in Portugal, who's a specialist of competitiveness, and she co-founded the Agency for Investment in Portugal. Vincent, who's CEO of Sopra Steria, which is an IT company. Merouane, who's a professor at Centrale Supelec and who's with us around the table, who's director of research, and also works for Huawei, and Elie, who's a research director at CNRS, specialist of industry, French industry, of course. You published in 2014 at Fayard edition the backing of industrial development. And Marianne Lombard, GEODIS, who's a specialist of transport and logistics. You're also an administrator with Vincent. I'm going to give the floor to the moderator of the session, who is Jacques BIOT, and who's a former president of Polytechnique, the engineering school. Hello, Franck. Hello to everyone. There used to be a time where in this country there was the national direction of the industry. Only those of us who have white hair remember that, and we remember Patrick Souviron, who was an iconic director of this institute, and he was coming from LEHMANN, which is a leading engineering school in France. This general direction would define some sector plans and would define which industries were strategic and where the state should invest in. And all of that was changed with the rules of the market, and France did pretty well without it. The crisis that has just happened has brought up back the word of relocalization. But when we talk about relocalization, what do we really mean by it? And the question really is what is to be relocalized and how? And with our panelists, we're going to try to figure out what are the factors that can lead the choices of strategic choices of companies. So our panelists are going to talk about various sectors, all, of course, more based on IT, technology, industry, logistics, pharmaceuticals industry. Elie will talk about that later on. But before we get into the depth of those specific sectors, LEHMANN, who had a political function and who has good capacity of understanding the theory behind those issues, is going to present the view of the Portuguese authorities and the academic world in which she evolves. Anna, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for this prestigious invitation. So this topic is very important and it's very complex. It's on the interplay between economics, geopolitics, and technology. With COVID-19, we reached unprecedented levels of uncertainty and questioned the path that we were following. Totally different from the crisis before, where we saw global value chains on steroids and the primacy of outsourcing and just-in-time. All about efficiency, unbundling, fragmentation, and a relentless form of globalization that is now being questioned on environmental and social equality terms. Of course, this brings this discussion on the location of economic activities, because this context that I've just described consecrated China really as the factory of the world, and a massive movement of offshoring and delocalization, including from Europe. And COVID-19 crisis made us aware of the excesses of the near past, of the recent past, and need to diversify the sources of supply in order to achieve more predictability and even national sovereignty, and even European sovereignty, I would say. So really, I would like also to mention another key challenge, because it's very important for this analysis and for what means relocation nowadays. And this challenge and opportunity is called digitalization of everything, of industry, of services, and of our lives. And so this brings also a new breed of economy. And nowadays, which are the biggest companies? They are platforms. So we live now in the platform economy that was very well explained by authors such as Nobel Prize winner Jean Tirole. So we live in a hyper-connected world, and we need to understand this context, where more automated and digitalized processes raise new questions on the future of labor, on the interplay between humans and machines, etc., in a context of flabbergasting speed of change. And this is very important. So what is the context we have on this digital world? We have these humongous digital companies, and none of the biggest is European. So this needs to make us think about these important trends. Plus, I would like to call the attention for the increasing complexity and convergence of technologies. Nowadays, things are very much changing, and we need more collaborative approaches. No one innovates alone. And plus, we need also to change our mindset, because nowadays in this new breed of economy, although, of course, the supply chain is important, but it's not necessarily the central aggregator of value. What does it mean? This means that these more and more digitalized companies not always own the means of production. They are more important because they develop a means of connection, and they connect resources. So this is a totally different reality. We cannot think about just the physical, the tangible world, although it is still very important, but we need to understand these trends. So digitalization brought, in my opinion, I would like to highlight two very central developments. One brings a much faster and cheaper internationalization, opening also important opportunities, but also increased competition, and also questions the very concept of markets. When I saw the topic of this debate, maps, I wonder how still relevant they are in the context of deterritorialization of markets, in the platform economy, in the digital economy. And we need to conceive global value chains and also platforms as markets. And this is very, very important. But this COVID crisis also called the need for greater proximity, for smarter value chains, more local and regional value chains. And so the vulnerabilities exposed by the pandemic crisis calls for more regional approaches, in which, of course, Europe has a central place, need for proximity to ensure the provision of essential goods. And this, makes us think on what are the sectors or activities that need to be located, and also the remotization of work and its implications for managerial purposes and for public policy. The other thing I want to highlight, as also food for thought in this debate, is it is an error to think only about the supply side. We are always talking about companies, talking about technology, but really, this needs to be crossed with a very important trend, with the demand side. Nowadays, more than ever, consumer is king, and consumer is the driver of change. This is very important. So we may speak about relocation, etc., but we need always to be customer-centered or user-centered. And plus, another topic is that digitalization should not be seen as a mere technological issue, because the key challenge is human. We need massive amounts of reskilling, of upskilling, And so this also bears a very big importance to relocation. Do we have the people in quantity to relocate? Do we have the right qualifications? So this is a case in point. In this fast-paced world, innovation is key, but innovation is ever more democratic and coming more and more from the side of the consumer as well. So we need also a new mindset on this. Also, we need to face the democratization of going global with the new world of startups, with digitalization. This opens opportunities for small and medium companies. We need also to think about these companies that are the vast majority of companies in every country in the world. So the world is not only for the big giants and big physical industry giants, but also for those companies that are scalable, that are nimble and agile, and that use networks as a source of competitive advantage. So we need to be less traditional when thinking about relocation. We need also to understand these facts. I think that the current breed of the evolution of globalization, etc., and digitalization will bring a lower importance of foreign direct investment, a lower importance of big factories, and a much bigger importance of contractual modes, of more collaborative and agile business models, especially web-based. So this needs, and to conclude, a new breed of industrial policy. Several countries are also, well, this new breed is based on innovation in clusters and on being competitive in this new world. Although, of course, now with the crisis, several countries are bringing relocation as a big issue on public policy, like Japan, US, and Australia, trying to diversify from China. But now, just a final word on relocation. Very importantly, I think that more than sectors, we need to define what are the types of activities. And Europe should bet, of course, on high value-added activities. Europe is still the beacon of sophisticated manufacturing. Europe has proposed the fourth industrial revolution. Europe is key on the link between sophisticated services and industry. So, another word, relocation is not easy and is not quick. There are sunk costs, there are scarcities of labor, there are not so qualified people sometimes for the tasks being done. So the numbers need to make sense. So of course, relocation is on the table, but we need to be a bit rational about it. State aid is not unlimited, especially in the pandemic crisis. We need money for other things as well. So we know, in a final word from Adam Smith, since the 18th century, that specialization and division of labor are the keys to growth and prosperity. So I don't plan to be producing my own pencils. I don't plan to expect that all the cars are produced, of course, in Portugal, or the food. What I think is that we need more networks that are sustainable, of production, European-based, and that really we need an equilibrium, we need more sustainable paths, we need more sustainable value chains, because there's no planet B. And hopefully, my hope is that Europe will be a beacon of this more balanced world.
Hey, I think that's it. Well, thank you very much, Anna Lehmann, for your presentation. You spoke at length of the digital world, and Mr. Paris, you've almost been called upon here to react to this Mrs. Lehmann's intervention. Yes, thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody. What strikes me on this topic, as many others, moreover, is that we unfortunately don't know how to move ahead other than in a to and fro motion. Globalization has taken place, and in the past few years now, there is a current of thought, quite rightly, that puts the spotlight on all of the failings of this extensive globalization. I'm thinking of the loss of sovereignty, of dependency, the non-control of risk. And so there's a movement today to 100% relocate all of our business. I don't think that that's the road we should be going down. Look, in the past, all of the civilizations that engaged in this defensive approach, and things didn't go well for them. And I like to recall what Newton said more than 3 centuries ago now. He said, men spend their time building walls, whereas we should be building bridges. And I think that today this is particularly suited to our era. So with regard to this vast question, I think there are 2 topics that we need to address in particular. How can we truly conciliate globalization and sovereignty? A lot puts them one against the other, but we have to find a way to bring them together. The second question, which is very close to that, is for the business that we have decided are strategic, that we wish to protect, that we wish to relocate, how can we make sure that in the long term they remain competitive, they remain at the cutting edge, and we continue to innovate? Because we know that a situation of monopoly or too great a protection does not go in the direction of competitiveness and innovation. I think that these are the 2 questions we must address altogether. And what I suggest very briefly is to propose 3 possible avenues. And I think that this is the direction we need to head in altogether. The first is clearly concerns industrial policy. Rather than reinventing hot water, I think that we must apply what the Ministry of Defense has been doing for the past 15 years, and that is to redistribute all of the businesses into 3 circles. The first circle is what we must control at the national level. The example is nuclear activities. The second circle concerns everything that we can control within Europe, for example, fighter planes. And the third circle is all the rest, for example, trucks or things like that. And so it would be we would need for all of our businesses and size industrial sectors to raise this question. What must we control locally? Of course, it's a dynamic approach. Depending on events, everything might need to be reorganized. But this is a direction that we need to really post up, and that all of the economic players should go in the same direction. And in that way, we would make good headway with a clearer policy. The second avenue that I wish to share with you, and it is part of our business, it's the digital contribution in all of this, and that is tremendous. I would like to insist upon 4 major contributions of digital technology. First of all, competitiveness. It's nothing new, but when we look at new technologies today, automation, smart machines, the optimization of supply chains, we can easily gain 20–30% productivity. And we see that there are a lot of small companies, niche companies, or even medium-sized companies that are relocating their businesses, which was possible before these technologies. And they managing to trace their pathway in a competitive manner. The second strength, second major contribution of digital technology is that it's a vector of acceleration to create champions. We need champions in France and Europe. We cannot be sovereign if we're in 2nd, 3rd division in all sectors of the economy, quite clearly. And we can see that creating a champion takes a long time. It's difficult. And if we have a monolithic approach and we wait for one player to know and have it all in one subject, it takes too long and it's too complicated. So the platform approach, the control of ecosystems that digital technology allows is, for me, a response to speed up the creation of champions in France and Europe, which is an essential condition. Just one example. We'll see what happens, but you've probably seen the news this week. An agreement found between Accor and Le Bon Coin, which is a website on which people sell things, individuals sell things, and this is to compete with Airbnb. And so it should allow Accor to live through this crisis. We'll see what this type of approach gives rise to, but I think that there are dozens of initiatives of this type that we should promote, and digital technology allows this. The third important thing is that it allows us to revive the territories. We see that 50 years ago, a lot of provinces were regularly losing jobs, and the recent episode shows this. Digital technology allows us to work remotely to reconquer different more remote territories. And the fourth strength of digital technology is that it really brings together industry and services. And that's very important because we can see the trends lean towards the use of products rather than their possession. And so this promotes global services of products and service. And so it's the service here that really makes a difference. It's the local, it's nearby services. Therefore, global differentiation can take place locally. And this would allow us to re-industrialize our country, which really needs it. 12% of our business is in industry. And so that's a very important aspect of digital technology. And quite clearly, the third direction, that's not new, but there's a lot to be done in this area, is to consolidate our attractiveness. Why today would a company wish to set up in France? The criteria is the same. Quality of life, of course, we're the champions in that area. There are the skills with the engineers and the higher education. So, of course, we're very competitive there. Infrastructures in that field, we were very good regarding road and rail networks, but we've been outrun. Just look at 5G, efforts made there. Social and political stability, social dialogue. There's no doubt worse than us, but we need to make a lot of progress in that direction. And an essential condition are the tax conditions are just as important for our stability over time. And we're not doing very well on those both topics. So I think... Thank you very much, Vincent Paris. Thank you. Thank you for this very broad overview where you touched upon many different themes that we can build upon in the second part of the debate. Merouane DEBBAH, could you add something? He talked a lot about strategic companies, and that's what you're all about. Yes, I'm going to try and be brief. A lot has been said. What is interesting in this crisis, the health crisis, that there's a comeback to traditional industries. So the telecom part for some time was considered to be something that, we had acquired. So there are canals, and these canals can save the situation. But I think that we kind of sat back on our haunches too much, and the investments were not implemented in all of these network infrastructures. But this rediscovery of traditional industries is very important. And in the States, we see when we needed to develop machines for the hospital, we didn't turn to Tesla and everything. But there's also the infrastructure, which is local, and I think that we haven't done well there. For example, the H2020 programs that I was involved in, and these are European research programs. The telecoms was considered as something that we had in hand, and all of the fields of research were the applications. But today, in particular, 5G was a really revealing. We realized that we'd missed the bus and that we hadn't made the necessary investments. So I think that that's very important. And also long-term investments. Let's look at 5G because I'm familiar with that topic. 5G isn't something just appeared suddenly. It started 10 years ago with research and investment. If we want to dominate a sector such as 6G, it's now we have to do it. But we have to set ourselves in a particular direction and keep on going. So in Europe, there's a certain philosophy. People say, well, we have researchers, that's wonderful. We'll do a lot in the research labs, and I have a lot of researchers doing research in the labs, but we realize that we also have to have some local industry that we can interact with. We're not going to go miles away to go and get our equipment and come back. So we shouldn't necessarily create everything, but we should create the vital elements for our development. And this activity will also be important for the researchers because we know that salaries in France and in Europe, it's very difficult to attract researchers. But there's also the ecosystem that is necessary, where if you manage to attract the researchers, they shouldn't be in a closed world, and there must be proper internet connections. So these are the 2 points I wish to point out. A lot has already been said, so I will stop there. Thank you very much. Very disciplined. Elie Cohen, you're going to focus on the question of pharmacies. Yes, because one of the major discoveries of this pandemic was the incredible degree of dependency of France for essential supplies, such as Cura, which is a very important substance for reanimation, or even paracetamol that we use every day. So we discovered all of a sudden that we were entirely dependent on countries such as China and India that concentrate 70 to 80% of the active substance supply. So as usual in France, the first reflex was to say, well, this dependency is unbearable and all of this is due to globalization. And so boo to globalization, we have to rethink a strategy for relocation. There are a whole series of possibilities, but we immediately thought in terms of criticism of globalization and the need for relocation. So it is not abnormal that we need to go and find supplies in all corners of the world. So the theory that structures thoughts around the global value chains is what we call the smiley curve. And that is what every industry must become global. And we see, therefore, that there is a deterioration of the manufacturing bases and a transfer towards different countries that specialize in manufacture. But however, the world of research, development and innovation, upstream and downstream commercialization is in the developed world. So the real question is, have we gone too far in terms of the transfer of production, which means that there are gaping gaps that are unbearable, which require relocation, and therefore have we gone well upstream to look for innovation, and have we developed commerce and marketing? Whereas if we look at the case of France, that is not the case, meaning that there is a deterioration of the manufacturing industry in the pharmaceutical sector, but there is no comeback in terms of research and innovation. In fact, there is an increasing gap when we look at different aspects. So for France, there is a situation where there is a disappearance of the manufacturing, but the upstream and downstream is not there. So we can see that the factors that are related to the economy of the pharmaceutical sector, to be short, it's the end of the blockbuster model, meaning the big pharmaceutical majors, Sanofi, etc., have an approach which consists in concentrating their R&D efforts on certain products, certain ranges of products, and certain platforms. And there are global centers, Cambridge, Boston, where the R&D is housed. On the other hand, there is less and less development of in-house research within the company, and increasing a number of acquisitions of innovative startups. So the role of the portfolio of patents, which goes through the acquisition of new companies. So therefore, in a country such as France, we suffer a double sentence. But is the solution relocation? When we look, not in France, but in Europe, we see that Europe is has a massive extent in the pharmaceutical area. And if we look at active substances, we can see that we have a big extent for high added value active substances. And less in the chemical substances. And when we look at why we have this situation, it's quite simply because there are environmental regulations in developed countries. There are social security regulations. So it means that the approach of the majors is to arbitrate against the location of the factories in France and in Europe due to environmental issues or problems of cost related to European sites. Therefore, what is the right strategy? We have to be short here, but the strategy is to look at three elements. And these three elements come under one umbrella, which is increase economic resilience of the pharmaceutical sector. That means three things. Firstly, it is intolerable, even when you're an absolute liberal, that there be a phenomenal concentration of production in one or two global sites or one or two countries in the world. It's not normal that 80% of the active substances for certain vital products are manufactured in India and China. So the first imperative is a diversification of supply sources. That means we have to possibly encourage locations in different countries so there's a diversity of the supply. Secondly, if we we don't want to suffer. We don't want to suffer a lack of different things in the event of a panic. So we have to have precautionary stocks and stocks that are built near the places where they're used. So these can be composed at the national level or the European level. And thirdly, yes, we have to envisage a relocation, but sometimes the industrialists themselves wish to do this in certain areas where the global value chain is very extended, and the incredible fragmentation of the production of each component that enters into a drug means that we no longer control the system, and we can't even have the traceability of all of the production of all of the intermediate production stages. And that requires the rethinking of regional value chains, and in particular in areas such as active substances that are considered as vital. And therefore, we need to relocate this in Europe. And there's a certain series of opportunities. And a new phenomenon is that there's a wake-up call in Europe due to this crisis. And there's a program called EU for Health, which was devised and developed and which can act as a basis for this strategy, which brings together these three aspects of the economic resilience for the pharmaceutical sector and which can be favorably deployed at a European level. So, even though we want to relocate these pharmaceutical global value chains, it's simply not possible due to the incredible diversity of the components of these drugs and incredible combinations which allow us to manufacture these drugs. However, we can try to control things, and this control means that we need to have knowledge. That's the first element, and via the diversification of supply sources. But the real dynamics that are underway here are that in a sector where there can be diverging interests between certain pharmaceutical labs within the framework of an optimization strategy and national interests, in particular of a health nature, then we need to think of a new sharing between companies and states in terms of the funding of research, development of research, and the location of these businesses. Look at what's happening in the United States during the COVID-19. Mr. Trump is putting the check on the table in order to control the product of research, to develop certain research, to manufacture certain vaccines, to make sure that he has exclusive rights to them. So that is a new sharing between the states and the pharmaceutical labs that we need to think and devise. If we consider the number of pharmaceutical products common goods for the world, then there needs to be a global or state funding of certain of these commons. Therefore, you see that the answer is not simple. Now we've found out all of this. It's not just relocation, it's a new architecture, a relationship between companies and the state. It's a new division of labour between the state and the companies. And above all, it's an investment in information to know what's happening, where it's happening, so that we don't find ourselves devoid of what we need in the event of a pandemic. So we've all talked about the question of the value chain, of transport, logistics, and we're lucky we have the woman of the question here.
So I'm going to be brief, even if logistics is a vital element, as you said, for companies and states and smoothness of the economy. What I wanted to say is that redistribution of sector maps had started way before the crisis. We had some phenomenon of relocation. I don't like the word, but it sounds very defensive. And for states, we have to be in an approach of reindustrialization or rebalancing, like Elie said, on the elements that we want to develop. So this sounds more offensive. And relocation politically is a reform. Reindustrialization is to reinvent ourselves. So I find it more inspiring. I was going to say, as a logistics specialist, we organize and manage the supply chain of our clients. So by definition, we are global. We see what's happening, and we see the flows of the economy. I want to talk about supply chain. All companies and the multinationals, but not only, are wondering already for the last 5 or 7 years on how to reconstruct their supply chain to avoid that they are disrupted supply chain, yes. We want to build the supply chain more resilient and environmentally wise. That's the goal of companies today. As a logistics specialist, when people ask us for solutions, the goals of the companies is how can I make my supply chain more resilient and how can I make it more environmentally sustainable. So the health crisis that we're living now has accelerated this phenomenon that was already there. What does that mean concretely? The companies have mapped out the risks of their supply chain, and that touches upon the risks of dependence, shortage, geopolitical risks. We could see that the taxes of customs, trade war that we see happening now between China and the U.S. are part of this block of risk, disruption with health issues, terrorist crisis, closing down of borders, the risk of inflation, and the environmental risk. So each company right now is basically scanning its supply chain and, depending on the risk, is developing a plan, a mitigation plan for these risks. And this is the multiplication of this work within companies that is going to redistribute sector maps in the world. So how is it going to play out? I've already seen major clients in high-tech for GEODIS who had 2 plants in China and closed them down 2 years ago to relocate them to Mexico. And from Mexico, they supply the whole world with their servers and their assets and that they sell to the rest of the world. So it had already happened, as I said, and we're going to find vertical markets, high-tech, pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, automotive, equipment goods, consumption goods. Each of these sectors is building the supply chain that is ideal and that meets the risk that they mapped out. As I said, we will see the emergence of countries or regions that will be selected because they meet the criteria that mitigate those risks. What are those criteria? Quality, cost of workforce, labor. Is it the cheapest one, but is it a quality labor? Can it welcome in this country the new industries, the infrastructures as well? Land infrastructure, air, marine, telecommunications infrastructure, because that's part of the infrastructures. If you have highways, for example, but you don't have 4G or 5G, you cannot ship, you cannot provide a supply chain. Taxes as well, the tax system. If as a country you tax the warehouse that is coming to set shop in your country more than the neighboring countries, you're not going to attract them. And sorry for my you have to be business friendly. I'm using an English word in French. In the redistribution of sector maps, if some countries want to attract this form of relocation or reindustrialization, they must go through their forces like a company would do and meet those criteria. So what is the new world, the productive new world? That's what my clients say. We go from China to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, India. We go from China to, if we want to target the Americas, to Mexico, and we go from China towards Eastern Europe, Poland, and Turkey. These are the big winners, the big winner countries who will get back the redistribution of these sector maps. E-commerce is going to keep growing, so warehouses, companies, if I could call it this way, mechanized, robotized, completely connected to very different systems will continue to emerge. with two areas of trade. So we'll see these warehouses growing in France. We'll have some. There will be some. And the logistics with the transversal sector will be will play a more important role in redistribution of sector maps, because when a company wants to move plants, they have an interest in being based on a strong logistics specialist who can allow them to do it without taking too many risks. As I said, if I'm talking about France, how can we get back some of these cards? We need to capitalize on our strengths. We need to map out our strengths and know-hows that could be useful in the future, and work on being more attractive, because I don't think that this country is very attractive yet for companies. The crisis has reminded us that companies are the backbone of a country. We know that in France, even though half of the active population work in companies, all the surveys show that the company itself is not well liked in our country. So we have to work on that, making it more attractive and being very clear on our know-hows. Thank you very much. Just a question before I give the floor to the audience. You said that all of you, that the redistribution of sector maps could be done to the benefit of our country at the condition that we will produce sophisticated products, and we're not all going to become engineers or researchers. So what does that mean? Breaking the world in two parts of high value added for some countries and brick and development for others. This redistribution is in favor of our country and to the middle class. Maybe, Mrs. Lehmann, you were the first one to talk about that and to even call for a form of specialization.
Yes. I called for some specialization because I think it is indispensable to make the world prosper. But the situation is not so simplistic that in several countries you'll have only the top high value added and others the not so high value added. I think in each country we need a mix and a balanced and diversified industrial base, and of course the accompanying services. But I am sure that Europe cannot thrive on low value added. On average, Europe has to focus, yes, on at the forefront of a sophisticated type of industry, but diversified sectors. For example, I didn't speak about it, but I think, for example, the role of precision agriculture is very important, for example, for sovereignty, but also with the introduction of artificial intelligence, etc. I didn't speak about another thing that I think is very important as well. Countries, for example, like France, have an industry also based on tradition, authenticity, and I think those industries with tradition have a great future because more and more people are looking for quality, sustainable, less consuming less items but higher quality. So the industry that thrives on authenticity and on uniqueness is also very important. So in all, I think we'll have still a diversified set of activities, but of course there will be some specialization among countries based on the range of variables that we discussed, from talent to costs, etc. And some countries will be more specialized on certain type of activities. I think there's no doubt about that. But even, countries from more emerging economies can produce, of course, and are producing great things.
Oui, Elie Cohen, la haute valeur ajoutée, la qualité.
Elie Cohen, high added value and quality is all very good, but is it enough to create a high number of jobs and to balance for this loss of employment within the industrial sector in recent years? Well, to answer your question, the simplest thing is to talk about the case of the automobile industry, which we haven't talked about here. What we saw in France is a collapse of the manufacturing of cars in France. Over the past 20, 30 years in France, we produced 2 times fewer vehicles, and all of this was done to the benefit of third countries such as Turkey, Slovenia, Morocco, etc. We decided to launch the production within France of small electric city cars. The production of these cars is very different from the factories that were closed down in the past and the production that we eliminated before. These new factories will be increasingly automated with increasing amount of artificial intelligence and less labor. And even when we relocate and we go in the direction that you're talking about, the industry is not the same at all as before. So I would like to highlight the fact that the new industry that we're devising should feed from the sphere of research, everything to do with electromobility, autonomous vehicles. And it's in that area that we're developing new skills and patents. So I am partially answering your question here, but for your more essential question, do you know what fraction of the active population is employed in the manufacturing industry in France? 9%. In any case, there's no point in wishful thinking. Even the massive relocation of industrial production in France will only marginally change the fraction of people employed in the manufacturing industry in France. And this is why I heavily underline the development stemming from research, the creation of new businesses, and the launch of productive businesses in France on the basis of these innovations. But for the rest, most of employment, as you know, will reside in services, and in particular services for people. So we have the impression that relocation is, yes, okay, but on condition that it's thanks to digital technology and automation. Do you confirm this, Mr. DEBBAH? Which is, of course, not disappointing because it creates added value and wealth. It creates wealth, but does it really create jobs? Will relocation be without people, but with more robots? The robots will be there anyway, so that is a trend. And the diagnosis was made recently. And generally speaking, we maybe have a poor understanding of industry. We're talking about new industries. In the industry of the future is very different from the industry of the past. That's the first thing. The second thing is in terms of hyper-specialization that has transpired. We mustn't believe that the Chinese and other countries are lagging behind. They're at top level. So we mustn't believe that just by magic we have all of the know-how and that they look after standard industrialization. Or they're scaling up. But the question is, how can we share this added value in a resilient system? And so we are focusing on the expertise and excellence of the traditional areas in France. And the diagnosis has been set down into our fields of excellence. And there is massive investment to be made in terms of research, and that will impact this industry through smart cities, etc., the industries that are currently being developed. So we're no longer in the past, and there's no longer separation saying that Asian countries only look after production. I go to China, and today in the telecom sector, let's be honest, that it's the best we can find in the world. So I think that there needs to be a sharing and to see where we stand in the value chain. Mrs. Lombard, do you wish to say something on this subject? No, I think that regard to employment, when we talk about industry, of course the industry is very different, even though industry is coming back to France, but it's very different from that of the 60s, at least for the laborers. But, of course, it's very interesting to re-internalize a certain number of things within the country. I do not oppose the old world and the new world. If there's a little bit more of a new world, then this will carry the old world along with it. There will be jobs that will be created anyway. But it raises the question of training. Yes, we have a question from one of our listeners about training. And say the people working in the sectors in difficulty, can they be trained so that they can keep their jobs and be part of the resilience that you're talking about? I can just tell you what we're doing in GEODIS. We can see that there's increasing automation in logistics warehouses. But we still need people. We need people, in particular for the distribution, the final kilometer. We also need people to organize flows. And we train these people so that they can do these jobs. And I touch wood, but GEODIS is continuing to recruit about 1,200 people per year, and no one is left along the way. So we're managing to provide them with other roles and functions because our company is growing. And just maybe one point on logistics, there are 5,600 billion of logistics expenditure in France, and 2,600 billion are externalized. So the crisis that reveals the non-resilience of certain supply chains will no doubt promote the externalization of logistics to logistics specialists. So a certain number of things that are done by companies will be shifted towards logistics specialists, and that will also create jobs in the logistics sector. So maybe it might not be an industrial sector that actually did their own logistics, but these logistics will be shifted to the logistics specialists, and they will be the ones that will be creating the jobs. So regarding training, we're talking about, there's a question of the green transition. This means that there should be jobs in the building industry and the automobile industry, which even if we apply the proposals of the civic convention that has been signed in France, there will be certain things that will, certain areas that will suffer and others that will emerge. There's the question of the ecological transition. And Mr. BIOT, you were a former chair of the Polytechnic School in France. This is a question. The training for the transition is key for the green conversion. So, of course, I'm going to step out of my role as coordinator, but as I love that job, and as I used to say in the Polytechnic School I used to teach in, I used to tell them they were there to learn science and technology and to place them in the service of society to rise and meet the challenges, which was that of challenge and health. And I told them there would be pandemics and the economic challenge, because the way in which the tremendous debt that is building up will be absorbed is a subject that we maybe need to do a little bit of maths about if we don't want it to fly apart. And then there's the question of security. So what's very important is that science and technology is what allows us to make sure that ecology is not a punishment. And to the contrary, it allows us to make things more human. So that brings us to the question of artificial intelligence in health. Look at dermatologists, all of the medical professions today that spend time looking at their computer, punching their computer keys. If tomorrow there are connected objects that feed back the information via 5G, you will be able to get rid of these medical deserts. We'll be able to valorize the medical knowledge of doctors. And therefore, it's there to bring back the human aspects of jobs. So the jobs will not be eliminated by robots. They will just be made far more interesting. So I'd like to come back to another subject to react to what Elie COHEN said on relocations. You said that we must raise the question on certain subjects if regarding the economic coherence, and we must think about relocation in the future within this context. You talked about relocation in Europe, whereas what people fear is, well, if we decide at the European level to relocate, and you more or less mentioned this, Mrs. Lombard, it might first be done to the benefit of countries which have very low labor costs, and we will have the same problem of relocated workers from Poland and Hungary, just as when Renault decides to close a factory to set up the same factory with Dacia in Bucharest. It is a form of relocation, but it's at the European level. So is the question of the scale not essential? Should we necessarily be sticking to the European level? Maybe for certain subjects, we need to think at the national level. So my question of geographical grid or network is related to what you're saying. So in which field is it relevant to think about the European level? And which the national level? The answer is simple. Look at what's happening in France currently. A certain number of companies are struggling, and the state has introduced a condition for subsidies. And in the area of the automobile industry, the French state was very frank, and they said for the new electric city cars, I want their production to be located in France, and my subsidies will be on the condition that a certain number of production lines, of new production lines, it was not a demand to relocate. No, that's absurd. To demand people to relocate is absurd. You're not going to relocate a production line which is in Turkey today and which manufactures diesel engines. You're not going to relocate that in Douai. In France, it would be ridiculous. The idea is to say new electrical city cars. As the French state is investing in electromobility and batteries, we want there to be a big electrical platform in the Renault's production sites, and that will be the restructuring of Douai, where there will be a number of electric production lines. So the state is not afraid. They condition the subsidies, they allocate on this. And as I was saying earlier on, in terms of the active substances in the pharmaceutical industry, we need to move from a situation where today 60 to 80% of the global production, which is taking place in China and India, to a situation where we would like there to be a European center for active substances. We're not going to say a French center. We need to reason at the European level, considering the 1,800 active substances of all of the different possible combinations in and the packaging for the drug. So that should be at the European level. The best example is, for example, we have a French company, Sanofi, which has decided to group together all of its European factories for active substances, and that wished to turn this into a fully fledged subsidiary, and wishes to locate an increasing part of the active substances production in Europe. And there will be a capital organization, industrial organization. The states will be able to intervene. A number of sites will be in competition to attract this business, and I find this quite normal. France alone cannot decide to relocate on the national territory the manufacturing of active substances that is massively located in India and China. Maybe you wish to add something.
Yes, on the relocation issue? No, on the framework of relocation. Yeah, I'm going to take the sector that I know well, which is the telecom sector. The champions of telecom today are champions at the European level. We try to develop. We saw what happened with Nokia recently. The idea, it depends on the sectors. We cannot do a relocation on sectors where the expertise and this value chain that is global. If I think about the telecom company that I know well, there's a lot of underlying elements of the telecom aspect that goes from the network to the core of the network, to the security issues, to what we call the radio access part, where we cannot have champions at the French level. So the European level makes sense. And some other aspects where we have an expertise, I'm thinking about IA, mathematics, on a particular segment. For example, in mathematics, we have very good schools in France. We have huge investments in R&D centers. A lot of people come to invest in France to take our French talents and do research. So this sectoral approach is very important. And we can do it. I want to add something. There's another I didn't mention, which is the geopolitical dimension. In this 5G area, the U.S. discovered that they are lagging behind. And we saw recently that there's a number of leaders in the U.S. who say, well, Nokia, there's a part that they develop. Isn't it in the interest of the U.S. government throughout different companies, and we think about Cisco among others, should not we benefit from the fact that Americans take over Nokia again to have know-how with the 5G and prepare for the 6G? So whenever we don't expect it, people start thinking about it between geopolitical and sector dynamic. So we have a question from the audience considering regarding 3D. And they say if the development of 3D printers is not going to disrupt the plan that we're thinking about on the development of manufactured goods and logistics. So what do these 3D printers entail on logistics? Because it poses the question of distance. Madame Lombard, I can answer on the logistic part. It's not the way it's going to happen. There'll probably be some specialized clusters because 3D is not a small printer that you put on an office desk. It's a revolution of manufacturing. We had, the revolution of e-commerce. Now we're going to have the revolution in the manufacturing sector with the 3D printers. But you have still today the OEMs and the automotive manufacturers who design automobiles, and they know how to do it. So the logistics specialist may get into the manufacturing part as for manufacturing a car. So you can imagine that they would invest massively in 3D. Mr. Paris, on this question of 3D, do you have something to say? Yes, like on all the other topics that we spoke about, we talk about 3D. There's a lot of technologies that are going to emerge, and what is true today will not be true in a few years. The global trend, the current trend is there, and in terms of employment and jobs, we need to combine services and industry. If we just play on products and industry, it's going to be complicated because we will industrialize more and more. The global competition is tough. We can make a difference, of course, with services, with proximity. I think it's a combination of both that will allow us to produce locally again, and we're going to have to pick our battles on the topics of the future and make sure that locally this mixity, products and service, is going to be the winning card. So that's really what we have to work on and be on top of the technologies. It's going to be up to experts more and more and open it up to services that will be accessible to everyone. You want to say something else on the scale of this relocation? There is a consensus saying that it could be done at the French scale in case if there is a French added value in terms of infrastructure, training. Otherwise, it may be more consistent to see it at the European level. What do you think? I don't believe on the duration of all the subsidies and this aids if we're not up to the same level of productivity than other countries. So we have to see how globally, over the whole of a value chain, we can be competitive. And if the investments are too heavy, of course, and we have to pool resources, we'll have to do it in Europe. Even if it's expensive, we'll have to get it done, and we'll have to relocate some industries in France. We'll have to be more transparent so initiatives can start and be launched. To wrap up, I'm going to give the floor to Jacques BIOT. I think we discussed a lot of subjects and also food for thought to how to deal with this relocation without being too naive. Thank you, Frank. It's a very rich debate, so I'm going to try to draw a few conclusions. The first one is that autarky is not an option. We cannot go back to the 17th century, and even in the 17th century, we're doing international trade. So, second lesson, is that the redistribution of sector maps, if we stay with the image of maps, let's not think about heart or spade, but it's more about having aces and kings and good and trump cards, and not twos and threes if we can, because that's how we're going to win the game and redevelop an economy that creates value and creates jobs as we want to have it. Third conclusion, we have to think long term. The students today who are studying at university or kids who are in school today, even if the generation of this year is going to be a bit shortchanged, they are the ones who will define our capacity to have trump cards in our hand. And we heard a call from most of the panelists to be more inclined towards science, industry, and technology. So we should probably work on that, on getting the cards back in our hands. So we have to work with the education authorities, the universities, so the young people are eager to learn and have the capacity to learn. They have the resources to learn. So science and technology be more present in our education. The other conclusion is research is very important. And we will move towards industry that invests in research, because there's not one sector that will be exactly like it was before. All the sectors will be changed, whether they're industry sectors, service sectors. Every human activity will be changed, and the redistribution of sector maps will be in favor of those who have developed the research. And also a research without a purpose, because sometimes big mutations come from a leap from research, from pure research. So there's no miracle solution. A lot of thinking, accumulation of knowledge to choose the industries to develop, and transversal resources in infrastructure, logistics, and development of know-how and education in this country. Thank you. Thank you to Marie-Christine Lombard. Thank you to Merouane, DEBBAH, Elie COHEN, to you, Jacques, and to all our audience, Vincent Paris and LEHMANN from Portugal.